Well, everybody, I'm trying my very best to make this class time as normal as it would be, like I've been doing for decades. Same sort of process. The only difference is going to be, first off, that none of you are here with me. And I tend to feed off of your responses to me, but we'll do our best. Mighty's here helping me record, and so I'll just have to rely on him. Also, one other thing is that the class time is going to be limited to 40 minutes, and that's mostly due to the amount of material that can be put onto one card or something in the camera. But that's plenty of me. That's about the time we would usually take a break. I have to be honest, I don't know how long it's going to be that we're going to have to meet like this. I won't bring it up every time, but I just want you to know that I'm going to be working out logistics over the next week with Susie Brown, who has been typing up my notes for, 15 years. She's the only person that can read my handwriting. And we'll start getting the notes out to you soon. And I'm also working with Jeff, who, those of you who come to the class regularly know, puts up maps and pictures and things. We're trying to figure this all out just to make it as normal as possible. But what I'd like to do now is just to get into this and go ahead into Mark. So let me pray for us, and then we'll read the passage and we'll go after it. Okay, Lord, I am thankful that we have this opportunity, this way to continue on to study your word. And I pray that my words will reflect your heart as we get deeper into the Gospel of Mark, that we will grow to know you in a much deeper way, and that we will love you. We'll love you in a deeper way as well, Lord. I just pray that your hand will be on that, all that I say today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, we are at verse 20 of chapter 3 in Mark. So I'm just going to read it, and then we'll go after it. It says in verse 20, "One time Jesus entered a house, and the crowds began to gather again. Soon he and his disciples couldn't even find time to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away. 'He's out of his mind,' they said. But the teachers of the religious law who had arrived from Jerusalem said, 'He's possessed by Satan, the prince of demons. That's where he gets the power to cast out demons.' Jesus called them over and responded with an illustration. 'How can Satan cast out Satan?' he asked. 'A kingdom divided by civil war will collapse. Similarly, a family splintered by feuding will fall apart. If Satan is divided and fights against himself, how can he stand? He would never survive.' Let me illustrate this further. Who is powerful enough to enter the house of a strong man like Satan and plunder his goods? Only someone even stronger, someone who could tie him up and then plunder his house." And we're going to stop there. This particular verse, the 20th verse of chapter 3, begins with an abundance of the use of the primary, I guess the word would be image-creating word in all of Mark's gospel. If you've been with me before, you know that we've talked about this earlier, but the images of coming, the word erchomai in the Greek, it's everywhere in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus comes from his Father. People come to Jesus. Jesus comes to people. This kind of thing is always happening, and this particular verb is everywhere, not only in the gospel broadly, but it's all over in this first verse in the Greek here. And the reason is that it's showing movement. This is a gospel of constant movement. And I'll read you this in the Greek in just a second, but what we have to remember is that this is a transitional point in the book. It's kind of like a chapter division. Jesus has now picked his disciples, and we're going to get into full-blown ministry. And here's what it says, this verse in the Greek. It literally says, "And he comes into a house and comes together again the crowd." Now, whose house this is, we aren't told. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's the crowd. It's articulated, the oxlos. And for those of you who've been with me in the past, you might recall that in any of the Gospels, anytime we run into the crowd, This is symbolic of a gathering that it cannot be fully trusted. One minute they're with you, and the next minute they turn on you. So like Jesus is in this house, and a crowd, they've heard that he's there, and so they start to fill the house up. And as I said, this house is not referred to as a specific home, but there's only been one house that's been mentioned in the whole of the Gospel of Mark, and that's Peter and Andrew's house. And so this is most likely where Jesus is. And the next sentence tells us how crowded this house has become. It says they were not able, and here it says they couldn't find time to eat. Now, I'm just going to say that this particular passage we're looking at is one of the most, I would say, it is one of the best examples of what's called a dynamic translation, where you're just trying to make sure that people understand what we're talking about, as opposed to going straight after what the Greek originally says. Here it says, in the Greek, it says that they could not eat bread. Now, this was a colloquial phrase, and we all know that when it says they could not eat bread, it doesn't mean that they were just trying to eat bread. It means they were trying to eat it all. They couldn't find, and it doesn't say they couldn't find the time as it does in the translation in the NLT. There's nothing about time in the translation. It just says that they couldn't find time to eat bread. This is like the phrase, when I was growing up, people used to say, hey, we'd love to get together and break bread with you. Well, they didn't mean come over to their house and break bread. What they meant was let's have a meal together. It's the same thing. And what's happening here is this is a really tight situation. This is not about having a relaxed meal with your friends. That's an impossibility, because they couldn't even find space in this house to eat. So you've got to picture this is like really, really tight. And the next sentence, it translates it in the NLT as when his family heard what was happening. This is a bit of a stickler. In the Greek, it literally says, and hearing the ones with him, they went forth to seize him. Now, the Greek phrase, it's oi parautou, and it tends to mean members of a household, or it also means those who are your attendants. In much of Koine Greek, it's used also, and probably here it's pretty assuredly, it means his family. Now, again, it's somewhat nebulous, and some scholars argue that this is the disciples, the ones with him. And they're standing outside, and Jesus is trapped inside, and they're outside coming, trying to get him out of there. And I can see how some people might come to that conclusion from the Greek, but it's pretty far-fetched, actually. Why would the disciples be coming to seize him, as it says, seize him? They're trying to take him away. That just seems crazy. It's pretty clear that this is his family. Now, what this whole passage from verse 20 to 35 is it's called a sandwich passage. We get Jesus' family trying to get him, and we'll talk about what they're trying to do with him. They're trying to get him here. And then we get a whole nother story, and then we come back to Jesus' family. And so what we get is a sandwich of stories. And this is very common for Mark to start something, stick something else in, and then put the back end of the first story on the other end. So this is what we've got here. So it just says that when his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away. It says he's out of his mind, they said. Now, where they'd come from, we find out later that this family is his mother and his brothers and his sisters. And when we get to that part later on the bottom half of the sandwich, we'll talk about that more. But what's happened is that they've heard about Jesus' actions, and it's concerned them, probably because it's bringing shame on the family. They have no idea what's up with Jesus. And it says they came to, now the word is kratesai. The verb is kratesai. And it generally means to arrest somebody. It means to grab somebody out of a crowd and take them into custody, to seize them. This was not his family showing up to have a little chat about what's going on with you, Jesus. No, they had every intention of once they got him outside, they didn't want to make a big scene in the house. And so they wait outside and they say, hey, let Jesus know. We're going to find out later that somebody says, hey, Jesus, your family's out there. And what the reason is, they think he's what? And it says in the NLT, he's out of his mind. The Greek literally says he is beside himself, which we have that phrase, but in the Greek it actually meant that there was something enough wrong with you that there was a whole nother you next to you, beside you, that you were out of your mind. And interestingly, a lot of the commentators always focus on the word berserk. We don't use the word berserk, but we get what it means. It means there's something going wrong up here. Now, the tendency in almost all modern scholarship is that any time we run into some sort of mental illness or demon possession, that they're the same thing. That somehow back then the people were just not sophisticated enough to know whether somebody was out of their mind or whether they had a demon. And so they always tended to just say demon possessed. That there was they didn't have a sense that there was a natural illness of the mind that could make you act oddly. And so that's what people tend to do. And anytime there's a demon possession, people go, well, it was just an illness that they couldn't recognize as an illness. Or it's something like that. Well, what we've got actually here in this story is we've got two groups of people. One group of people who think he's out of his mind, and another group of people who are going to say he's possessed by the devil or that he's working with the devil. And the truth is, these are not one and the same things. And I just want to say this, that there's very little evidence that ancient people could not tell the difference between demon possession and mental illness. In fact, R.T. France, who has this monster, wonderful commentary, goes to great lengths to show that the ancients knew exactly when somebody was out of their mind and exactly when somebody was controlled by an evil spirit. It's worth the read if you really want to know about it. But this moment isn't about two concerns that are actually the same thing. It's about two separate issues, and his family literally thinks he's lost his mind in the midst of all this nonsense. And so they've come they've come to rescue him by force. And if necessary, they want to take him home back to Nazareth, which is it's a probably 10 or 12 mile walk. I can't exactly remember the distance, but they want to take him home. Why? Because they want to help him come back to his senses. But right at this moment, when we know that his family is waiting outside, Mark changes the story. He starts the middle of the sandwich stuff. He starts where it says, but the teachers of the religious law who had arrived from Jerusalem said he's possessed by Satan, the prince of the demon. That's where he gets his power, they're saying, to cast out demons. Now, when it says it came down from Jerusalem, I always remember the directional language down in the Bible, or up. We think north and south. We can't help it because we are used to maps. But that doesn't mean that to them. It means in altitude. Jerusalem was way high, and so they've come down to Capernaum. Well, they've not only come down to Capernaum, it's a 3-day walk. They've come a long way. I mean, these guys are, they're not messing around, because this must have been important to check Jesus out, because it took them 3 days to get there, and this is a week's worth of work. If they only get a day with Jesus, it's still a week's worth of work. Now, we know that the Jewish hierarchy was always concerned about charismatic, and I don't mean that like charismatic in the sense that we use it, but like teachers who would captivate people, and they could like take over a whole town or something. They could start problems in places, and so they were always sending out groups of religious leaders to check out what's happening. If they heard something was happening in some place, they would do that, send them out to check it out. And this group of scribes from Jerusalem, these are bigwigs. They'd clearly heard that something was going on. They'd heard it all the way back in Jerusalem, and so they send out this group of people. We can't tell from the text that they came with a distinct prejudice against Jesus' ministry, but that we don't get anything but condemnation from them anywhere. I mean, all they say is what? Jesus is casting out spirits by the power. Well, in our translation here, it says by Satan. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, there wasn't any question about whether Jesus was actually casting demons out and whether he was healing. There's no question about that. They could see that he was doing it. It's just like, how did he have the power to tell demons what to do? And the other problem was that most of his healings that we hear about happened on the Sabbath. And you're not supposed to heal people on the Sabbath. That's like breaking all the rules. And so they're seeing something weird here. And so the first words we hear from them, and in the actual Greek it says, he has Beelzebul. Beelzebul. And that Greek could mean a couple of things. One, it could mean, when it just says he has Beelzebul, it could mean he is possessed by Beelzebul, or he has access to the power of Beelzebul, which are two different things. If you're possessed by him, then he is actually working through you. If you've tapped into the power, it tends to mean that you've learned the incantations that make the demons do what you say, and you only learn those through the black arts. One thing, I think my NLT actually tells us that Beelzebul is in there in the text as opposed to Satan. We've never, that name doesn't show up anywhere. That's the only place that it's ever used. The other two Gospels that tell this story, they don't use this word either. We know what it means. It means Lord of the house. We don't know where it came from. It's very close to Beelzebub, which means Lord of the flies, who was the great Philistine god. Whatever it is, they're using this word to mean the most powerful, when it's called the Lord of Baal, the most powerful of all of the demons. When they say he has him, he's either possessed by him or he has power from him. What they're thinking is that this demon is giving Jesus an authority over other demons. Now, here's why they would say that. They believed that the demon world was highly organized, that it was very hierarchical in the worst sense. Like if you were at this level, then everybody beneath you had to do whatever you told them. And this was, you didn't have an option. And if somebody was above you, you were subservient to whatever they told you. And so they're saying that Jesus had access to the highest person on the org chart in hell. And thus, the only reason that he could do what he was doing was he had some kind of power from the prince of the demons, that is Satan. And so when he said, do this, either the demons heard something that said, this man has authority from Beelzebub or Beelzebul, or else it says that they hear the voice of Satan when Jesus speaks, and they have to do what he says. Now, this would be forced obedience. Interestingly, by the 2nd century, Jewish thinking had so codified around Jesus having learned black magic arts in Egypt from a man named Pantera. Of all things, there's a famous band called Pantera. Well, they named their band after the black arts magician who supposedly taught Jesus all of his magic arts and dark stuff, and that all Jesus was doing was fooling ignorant Galilean people with his magic that he'd learned in Egypt. And oddly, that still exists. That story still exists in some Jewish circles. But these scribes were not capable of seeing the power that Jesus had in any other way than contrary to the way God would work, as they saw the way God worked. So they're seeing red flags everywhere. Healing on the Sabbath, demons obey him. They think this is all terrible. It's interesting. We've come to a point in the story where, let's just think about it. Jesus is ready to really get things rocking, and his family thinks he's crazy, and the religious leaders think he's in line with the devil. It's all happening at the same time. Can you imagine how sad that would be for Jesus? He's just called the 12. He's ready to get going, and everybody, his family and all the authorities want him to quit. Right there. They want to stop him. Now, verse 23, it begins with saying, and it's a highly proactive word. The first word it's a really long Greek word. It's proskalesemenos. Proskalesemenos. It means to call someone to yourself. And so what actually happens is that Jesus just calls him over. He just starts talking to him. He calls him over, and it says, I love the NLT, it says responded with an illustration. The text is actually parable. Now, the word parable in the Greek means something very specific. It means a fictitious narrative with a common life moral or it's a fictitious narrative of the common life, and it has a moral to it. And we get that like in the prodigal son, or we get it in the Good Samaritan. But what Jesus does here is not a parable, even though the word in the Greek says parable. That's why it's great to say with an illustration. Here's what's happening here. The Hebrew people had a word, it was mashal. And mashal meant way more than the word parable meant. In the Greek, the word parable meant this, but a mashal was huger, way huger. And like with a mashal, it could be an ethical maxim or a popular wisdom phrase or proverb. It could be even a taunt song or riddle or an oracle or a fable or an allegory or a comparison and contrast story. All these things fell into the mashal bucket, but there's no word like that in the Greek. And the closest thing was parable, so they stuffed mashals into the parable bucket when they translated this. And so we often get Jesus speaking in parables, and it doesn't sound like a parable at all, because it's not. It's a mashal. But there's no way to say this in Greek, and so we just have to struggle with that. Anyway, what Jesus does, he's not speaking in a parable. He's speaking in what? He's speaking in a mashal, and what he does is he asks them an informed question, which is normal for Jewish teachers. He says, how can Satan cast out Satan? And there would have been an answer to that. Well, somebody could have said, well, the way that Satan could cast out Satan is that he could be working the system and Satan could tell people to do what he wanted them to do. But before anybody can say this, Jesus answers it. And what he does is Jesus starts speaking about the whole world of Satan as a monolith, like a kingdom. And he says a kingdom that's divided against itself can't stand. He says it leads to vulnerability. Civil war makes it so that outside attack can come in. And it would be a bad thing. Now, it wasn't a given in their world that anybody casting out demons was definitely working for Satan. We have enough records of Pharisees who had the power to cast demons out, who spoke and demons obeyed. There's enough evidence of that it wasn't a given that this was the case. And yet, that's where these guys go first. But Jesus is saying that Satan commanding other demons to let go of their captured prizes would be really counterproductive. He gives them a second similar example. He says, uses the word house. I think it says, similarly, if a family, that says in this translation, a family, well, that's okay. The word term house there in the Greek can mean a family, like the House of Windsor when we talk about the English royal family. Sin, if they're all fighting with each other, how can they stand? We understand that kind of language, that Satan has too much to lose if he starts fighting with his own foot soldiers, if he starts undoing what they did in the battle that they had to go through to go and get into somebody and take over and all the stuff that it takes for them to possess somebody. If they win that, why would Satan come in and throw them out? If he's fighting with his own, then his end is near. And Satan says, or Jesus says that Satan is no different than a kingdom or a family or a household or anything. He says, I'm just going to upend your logic here, guys. He's saying, I am not working for Satan. In fact, I'm working against him. This is where he's headed. His argument is strong. Nobody goes, hey, wait a minute, Jesus, I think I have an answer to your question there. Then nobody raises their hand and says anything. And in Mark 3:27, the image shifts, but it's still overall the same message. It's the same message. And again, I'm going to say this is one of the best examples of a dynamic as opposed to a literal translation of the Greek I have ever seen. The amount of stuff that they add and subtract and do to this Greek here is just amazing. And yet, I'm going to tell you that the translation or the way they put it in the NLT is exactly right. They have it. If I'll read the raw Greek, it's, but cannot anyone into the house of a strong man entering the goods of him to plunder, unless first the strong man he bind, and then the house of him he will plunder. That's the raw Greek. Jesus is quoted in here as saying, who is powerful enough to enter the house of a strong man like Satan and plunder his goods? Only one even stronger, someone who could tie him up and then plunder his house. Now, that makes sense to me. And I will say that there's a lot of heated controversy over whether this section is talking about Satan trying to plunder God's house or Jesus plundering Satan's house. Both arguments are pretty good from the Greek, but it's pretty clear that the NLT guys have made their decision. They're all down with the fact that this is Jesus plundering Satan's house. This is not Satan plundering Jesus's house. Satan is not tying up God and hauling off God's goods. What's happening is that Jesus is now in the business of tying up Satan and plundering his goods. I just want to say that Jesus saying this is a clear statement that he is not working with Satan. He's working against Satan. And we're going to actually see this everywhere as we go on in Mark, that what Jesus does is constantly tying up. The word in the Greek is bind. People talk about this, what you bind and loose and all this. Well, bind in the Greek is deise, and it's a very common Septuagintal word, the Greek version of the Old Testament, for what God does when he's tying up or binding the wicked. So this would immediately, in everybody's mind, when he says you have to go in and bind the strong man, that is a really strong hint from the past of the Old Testament that we're about binding up what? Evil creatures, evil people. And so Jesus, his statement here about the binding up of the strong man is both an explanation and a defense of all that he's doing. He's explaining that his work is plundering Satan's world. He's saying that it needs to be done. When he heals people, when he casts out demons, all this stuff that he's doing, he is breaking the bonds of Satan over the world. He is tying up Satan and plundering out that which Satan had taken in. This is a really, really important thing to remember. Jesus' obvious command over demons was being questioned as being the work of Satan, as opposed to the work against Satan's kingdom. And as I said earlier, the Pharisees they exorcised demons as well. So what this was doing was putting every person who ever works seemingly against Satan into question. The Pharisees in this moment are actually accusing their own guys of working for the devil. But what we want to remember, and this is where we come to an end in this passage. Now, the next thing are verses where Jesus talks about the unforgivable sin or the unpardonable sin. We need to do that on its own next time. But what we have to remember that every time we see Jesus at work, every time that we see him healing someone from something that is ruining their lives, and in the process generally removing them from a social injustice, which is unimaginable. We'll talk more about that as we get into more healings. Or every time we see somebody who is possessed by a demon, and Jesus frees that person from that oppression or that possession, what he's doing is he is plundering Satan's house. He is winning back. He is winning back that which belongs originally to God and has been stolen. This powerful Satan has tied things up, stored them in his house, and Jesus is coming in and he's tying up the evil one so that he can change the world for the good. This is what it's all about. It's all about healing that changes the world to look more like the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of Satan. This is a powerful moment. I'm sure that the Pharisees at that time that heard this, these scribes that heard this from Jesus, were angry about it because he had publicly, in a room you couldn't even breathe in hardly, he had said, you guys are dead wrong. You made a 3-day trip and you need to rethink everything. I'm sure this didn't sit well with him, but what we're going to see is that this is the mission of Jesus. The kingdom of God is near. Okay, we'll stop there. I will see you next week, and we'll start with the wonderful verses about the unpardonable sin. Okay, I'll see you next time. Thanks.